Hi, everybody. Can you hear me okay? My internet's actually been acting funny as I've listened to you for the last little bit. You can hear me? Okay, good. Um, I visited a cemetery recently. Um, I do this kind of often, and it's not because I attend lots of funerals or anything like that. It's just because I kind of like to go to cemeteries, and some of you know that I'm like a hobbyist photographer, and so I took some pictures when I was at this cemetery recently in New York and posted some pictures on Facebook of gravestones and statues of angels and whatnot. Um, and had a brief conversation with a Dhamma buddy on there about Maranasati, mindfulness of death. And that conversation led to the use of a certain word, which is samvega, Buddhist word samvega, Samvega, but sometimes the V's sound like W's. And the word is translated in the suttas, in the Buddhist scriptures, as a sense of urgency, But like so many words in the Buddhist lexicon that come to us from Pali or Sanskrit, there's a lot of meaning built into that original word that isn't really easily translated. But before we get to all that meaning in that word samvega, I'm going to read a little bit from a sutta. Now, some of us may have heard this phrase before, the phrase of the lion's roar. And it's a phrase that is used in Buddhist scripture to refer to the teaching of the Buddha, to the Dhamma in general. There's a few different contexts it's used, but I'm going to read a little bit of a sutta from the Anguttara Nikaya. And the sutta is called The Lion. This is the Buddha speaking, and he's talking to members of the sangha, and uses the word bhikkhus, which is the word for monks. And he begins, "Bhikkhus, in the evening the lion, the king of the beasts, comes out from his lair, stretches his body, surveys the four quarters all around, and roars his lion's roar 3 times. Whatever animals hear the lion roaring, for the most part, are filled with fear, a sense of urgency, and terror. Those who live in holes enter their holes. Those who live in the water enter the water. Those who live in the woods enter the woods, and birds resort to the sky. So powerful among the animals is the lion, the king of the beasts, so majestic and mighty. So too, bhikkhus, when the Tathagata, now Tathagata is the way the Buddha refers to himself when speaking, when the Tathagata arises in the world, perfectly enlightened, accomplished in true knowledge and conduct, unsurpassed trainer of persons to be trained, he teaches the Dhamma thus. 1, such is personal existence. 2, such is the origin of personal existence. 3, such is the cessation of personal existence. And 4, such is the way leading to the cessation of personal existence. Now, those are the 4 noble truths, just kind of framed in slightly different light than we typically hear them. But the Buddha continues, when those devas, these are the deities, the gods, when those devas who are long-lived, beautiful, abounding in happiness, dwelling for a long time in their lofty palaces, hear the Tathagata's teaching of the Dhamma, for the most part, they too, like the animals, are filled with fear, a sense of urgency, and a terror thus. It seems that we are actually impermanent, they cry, though we thought ourselves permanent. It seems we are actually transient, though we thought ourselves everlasting. It seems that we are actually not eternal, though we thought ourselves eternal. And so the comparison that the the Buddha is making here between the lion in the forest and the Dhamma is that it inspires, even in beings that live many aeons, a great sense of urgency. And if you listen to the way that these devas, these deities, respond to the Dhamma, they cry out about being impermanent. They cry out about being transient. They cry out about being non-everlasting, right? And so really the thing that strikes the fear, the thing that strikes this, creates this sense of urgency, which is the word samvega, is impermanence. It's the underlying part of the Dhamma that creates this sense of urgency. So now we can talk a little bit more about this samvega. So there's a relatively famous monk named Thanissaro Bhikkhu, and he defines samvega with three components. But one thing that he says is that this is the first emotion that we are supposed to bring to the training. This is the first emotion that we are to bring to the path, to the Dhamma. And I might add that it's not necessarily something we bring to the training. It's something that delivers us to the training, if that makes sense. And so here are the three components of this samvega and why just a sense of urgency doesn't quite capture all of it. The first component is this sense of shock and dismay or alienation that come with the realization of the futility and meaninglessness of life as it's normally lived. The oppressive sense of shock or dismay that come when we realize that the way we normally live life, mindlessly, can appear futile and meaningless. The second component is the chastening sense of our own complacency and foolishness in having let ourselves live so blindly. So this part of realizing that we were willing participants in living foolishly and blindly. And then finally, the third part is the anxious sense of urgency in trying to find a way out of it, right? So dismay at the seeming repetitive cycle of suffering, almost like shame to a certain extent at our complicity in living so blindly. And then the urgency that's inspired when we decide we don't want to live that way anymore. Now this samvega, this sense of urgency, which is all I'll call it now, understanding that those three components are part of it, could lead to something like nihilism, right? Towards the idea that all of life is meaningless, that, we're all going to die, it's all impermanent, so what's the point, right? It could lead in that direction, but the Buddha warns us against that sort of attitude. So this samvega comes with another component. There's another attitude of mind that tempers the urgency, that tempers the samvega, and funnels it, if you will, in the proper direction. And this Buddhist phrase is pasada, and that's P-A-S-A-D-A. And this is typically translated as clarity and serene confidence. It tends to mean that one understands that there actually is a path forward. And I think the simplest way of putting it then is that where samvega inspires kind of terror and fear and urgency, pasada provides hope. Pasada provides hope that there's a way out. And we must have both of these for the practice to really bear fruit. But we must have that first one, that sense of urgency, in order to come to the practice at all in the first place. So there's no coincidence that the Four Noble Truths are framed as the truth of suffering, the cause or the origin of suffering, the cessation of suffering, and the way leading to the end of suffering. And it's no coincidence that the first one is suffering, because it is the entry point. It is the gateway. We wouldn't have sought out a practice of some sort. We wouldn't have sought out some type of personal transformation if everything was fine. I know I wouldn't have, and I have a feeling most of us in this room have a similar story. Now, it doesn't have to come at the hands of like something particularly dramatic or singular. It can come after a long series of events in one's life. It can just come after, as in the Buddhist story, a sense of disillusionment or unsatisfactory that one finally wants to get to the root of. But the point is that it's still the gate. It's still how we all get here. So this concept of samvega and pasada is actually demonstrated in the story of the Buddha. And I'm not going to tell the whole story, but most of us are familiar with the idea that when he was still living as a prince, before he had gone out to the forest and started meditating with the yogis, that he was kind of living a sheltered life, right? The way the mythological story goes, he was kept from seeing the worldly winds, if you will, of aging and sickness and death. He was sheltered from that because his parents feared that they might inspire what we might call samvega. And samvega, of course, is what inspires one towards a spiritual path. And his family also kept him from meeting with those forest yogis, probably because it might inspire pasada, hope for a route out of the suffering and some way of channeling that samvega. So he was sheltered from those parts of life. And as we all know, he ended up seeing them. He ended up seeing aging. He ended up seeing illness. He ended up seeing death, and had this sense of urgency inspired. In the Majjhima Nikaya, at that moment, the Buddha, where he recalls in the Majjhima Nikaya that moment when he says, "Why, being myself subject to birth, do I seek what is also subject to birth? Why, being myself subject to aging and sickness, death, sorrow, and defilement, do I seek what is also subject to aging, sickness, death, sorrow, and defilement?" Suppose that being subject to birth, having understood the danger that is the danger in what is subject to birth, I seek the unborn and seek supreme security from bondage, namely nibbana, which is the Pali word for nirvana. So he had this samvega inspired in him, and then he saw one of those yogis, right? So he had seen the aging, the illness, and the death, and then he saw a guy meditating. I imagine it as like some guy looking kind of peaceful or blissful, sitting underneath a tree. And the Buddha's like, what? Or he wasn't the Buddha at the time. Call him Siddhartha. Said, what's up with that guy? And his chariot driver told him that he was seeking a way out of suffering, and that provided the hope. That provided the way of channeling that sense of urgency into a path forward. So that's the story of the Buddha, but we don't all have the exact same story. But I think the idea that suffering in general, whether it comes as the form of aging, illness, or death, or just the way it's described in the First Noble Truth, is like losing what one wants, not getting what one wants, getting what one doesn't want. All those forms of suffering are what bring us to this practice. So our flavor, though dukkha, though suffering is universal, our particular flavor is probably unique. I know for me, prison is what brought me to the Dharma. Now, I had been exposed to the Dharma previously. I'd been to prison the first time. I had gone as a teenager, and after coming home, I was doing pretty well. I was taking a junior college course in Eastern philosophy, and there was one segment that covered Buddhism, and kind of just the basics of the teachings, a little overview of the different schools of Buddhism. And but I remember hearing those Four Noble Truths and that Eightfold Path, and hearing about suffering, impermanence, and non-self, and just feeling a great sense of familiarity. Just feeling like I've heard this before. Now, some teachers might say it's because you've been exposed to the Dharma in a past life. That's possible. I tend to think it's because it was true and is true. Despite that, I didn't yet have that sense of urgency. Why? I just wasn't suffering enough. But I took that teaching away as something that I thought was true and would be useful in the event I was suffering enough, and filed it away somewhere in my mind. Put in the file manager, like open when hurting, something like that. And a couple of years later, I was facing life in prison, and I decided that I was hurting enough to open that file once again. And I was in a bad place. At the time I was facing 400 years to life under California's 3 strikes law. My closest childhood friend had killed himself. It's part of the reason I relapsed on drugs. My then wife was leaving me, and I was in a pretty deep state of depression, and I had a lot of suicidal ideation. I had plans for when I would kill myself, court dependent. And so I lived in that place of hopelessness and nihilism and despair that the Buddha warned people who experienced samvega not to go to. But that's where I lived. But I had just this thought that things actually couldn't get any worse for me at all at that point, and which meant like everything was open to me as a possibility because nothing could possibly get worse. So I might as well try stuff, right? And so one of the things I tried was recovery. At the time, it was 12-step recovery. And the other thing I tried was the Dhamma. And I started, kind of on my own. I was in the county jail. There wasn't Buddhist-based recovery available. There wasn't a Buddhist sangha or anything like that. I certainly didn't know any Buddhists in there. So for me, it was reading and just kind of trying things out. And that's what I did for a couple of years in the county jail before I ended up in Folsom State Prison and sat in sangha with the early iteration of the Boundless Freedom Project. So in 2007, I ended up in Folsom State Prison, and that's where I sat with Diane and Terry and a handful of other volunteers, that some of whom are still around here. And so that's how I came to the Dhamma, was that deep sense of suffering that came from me with facing life in prison and just realizing that life was, to that point for me, seemingly futile and meaningless. So one thing I think, and I know there's people from different traditions in here, and you can correct me in the commentary afterwards if I'm wrong, but one thing I think that makes Buddhism a little bit unique is that it teaches us not to try to rid ourselves of this samvega, to not try to rid ourselves of this sense of urgency and even some of the terror. If anything, it teaches us invites us really to try to make it ever present, such that it invigorates our practice. So the goal is not so much to get rid of samvega as to find a way of transforming it into something akin to energy for practice, right? So in some way, as time has gone, it's been 18 years since I first started practice. It's been 18 years since I was in kind of just really in my dark night of the soul, to use St. John of the Cross's phrasing. That pain back is not as, let's just say, present. It's harder to touch into it. So in some ways, I have to find ways as time goes on of touching back into the urgency that inspired me for practice in the first place, right? And transform that, what could have been a kind of a desperate sense of urgency, into, like I said, energy. Now, the word that's sometimes used in the Buddhist world is virya, and it has the same roots as virile or virility, and it comes with this kind of connotation of like courageous energy, fearlessness, an energy that is fearless. And that is what, in an ideal world, we want samvega to be transformed into through practice, is fearlessness. When I was in prison, I spent the last 3 years in a fire camp, and so I fought fires when I was in prison. And we used to do this live fire training where they'd take us out to a grass field and they'd light the grass on fire and we'd chase it down. And I don't want to get into too much of the mechanics of fighting grass and wildfires, but the general idea of it is that we have hand tools and we are trying to cut a line in down to bare soil between what is burning and what hasn't yet burned, right? So we're trying to cut a break between the fire and the fuel. And usually when we're fighting fire, the wind is at our back. That's actually the ideal. You want the wind at your back so the flame is getting pushed away from you. Sure, it's hot, but the wind is pushing the flame away from you. And when things get hairy and the wind starts swirling, our general instruction is to back up and then kind of retreat back down the fire line we'd already created. That's the general instruction. But when things get really hairy and the wind shifts direction completely, and of course this would mean the fire is blowing back towards you, guess what the instruction is? It's a rhetorical question. You don't have to answer. The instruction is to actually walk, leap, or jump into the fire. Now, this only works for like a grass fire. You don't do this with like brush fires and things like that. But we're instructed with a grass fire to actually walk into the fire. Why do we walk into the fire? Because on the other side of that relatively small, narrow wall of flame is something that's already been burned. There's no fuel on the other side of the fire. And so though we walk into the fire and we might get burned a little bit, safety is on the other side of it. And so that's the type of fearlessness that the practice, I think, is inviting us to partake in. That's the type of fearlessness. The idea that the way out of suffering is actually being willing to get burned along the way. The way out of suffering is, in fact, through the suffering. So we have to reinvigorate this samvega. We have to reinvigorate this sense of urgency. And how do we do that? I mean, of course, we can recall those times in our life when things were terrible. That's, of course, one way of doing it. And there are times when I recall what it was once like, and that is a motivation for practice. That is a useful way of energizing practice. But there are also instructions in the suttas. One of them, which I briefly mentioned at the very beginning, is maranasati, which is mindfulness of death. And there are different ways of working with death in Buddhist practice. One way is basically a breath meditation, which one inhales and then exhales, almost with the assumption that it could be one's last breath. Inhale, and then breathing out, letting go, as if it could be one's last breath. That's one way of working with it. Another way, and it's a little bit more gruesome, is something that's in the Satipatthana Sutta. And that's where there's an actual progressive visualization style meditation, and one imagines one's own corpse and then the progressive stages of decay, all the way from kind of a fresh cadaver through bloating, all the way to the animals picking you apart, all the way to dust. That's one way of touching in with it. One of my favorite scholar, practitioner, teacher monks out there, Bhikkhu Analayo. And by the way, this is a monk who sleeps in a coffin. Just to let you know, like how in touch with Maranasati he is. He sleeps with a coffin, but he talks about the practices of mindfulness of death as trying to be in touch with the sting. Trying to stay in touch with the sting, because the sting, again, is what motivates us for practice. I have a human skull in my living room, like a real one. Sometimes I just like holding my future in my hands while I meditate as a way of getting in touch with the sting. In the Anguttara Nikaya, there's something called the 5 recollections. The sutta is actually called themes, but we know of them as the 5 recollections. And these are not necessarily meditations, though they can be, but these are themes that one should reflect on, or he invites us to reflect on regularly, as much as possible throughout the day. And the first one is, I am subject to illness. I am subject to aging. I have not gone beyond aging. I am subject to illness. I have not gone beyond illness. I am subject to death. I have not gone beyond death. I will grow separate from everything that I hold dear. Let that one sink in for a second. I will grow separate from everything that I hold dear. And then the fifth one is, I am the owner of my action, the heir to my action, born of my action, related to my actions. I have my actions as my arbiter. So those first four inspire samvega. That last one is the inspiration to action. That's the hope, the fact that there actually is a way to contend with this. So it's not all morbid. We don't have to only use suffering as a way to practice. In fact, that's really the gate, right? Like that's the way we get to the practice. And it is certainly a useful way of reinvigorating and energizing practice as we move along. There will be times when we have more and less energy, and knowing the practices that can inspire us are useful. But there are also more positive ways of inspiring practice, especially once one has already landed on the path, once one has already found the Four Truths and the Eightfold Path and made it their way of life. So one of the ways of doing this is recommended in the suttas as well, is recalling the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha, recalling the triple gem. The fact that there is a person who has done this before, the fact that there is a teaching leading the way to that ancient city in the forest, as he sometimes calls Nibbana. There's the teachings there, and there are people to do it with. There are people who will support us as we do this. This can serve as inspiration. The suttas also recommend pilgrimage. It's recommended to visit the birthplace of the Buddha, the place where the Buddha was awakened, the place where the Buddha gave his first teaching, and the place where the Buddha died. I can say with firsthand experience that this is a powerful experience. I remember reading the first sermon of the Buddha at the place where the Buddha gave the first sermon in a suburb of Varanasi, a place called Sarnath, and breaking down into tears because it was just such a powerful experience. And it's something I can recall today. And I understand we can't all go on pilgrimage to India, but we can still find sacred spaces or make sacred spaces where such inspiration can happen. We can go to temples, we can create shrines, we can have places where we meet with sangha. We can make those places sacred. But there comes a point in practice when the practice itself provides the urgency. There comes a point when suffering isn't the only thing that pushes one along the path. There comes a point when one, with diligence, sees clearly, however temporarily. There comes a point in practice when one starts to have insights, when one starts to experience a mind that, however temporarily, is free. When one gets to experience the joy that comes when there is no greed or hatred or delusion, when there is no self and there is no clinging, and none of those things are getting in the way. There's a sutta that talks about a wanderer lost in the desert, thirsty, and he finds an oasis. And in the oasis, there's a well. And he looks down to the well and he sees water, but he knows he must continue back out into the desert because he has somewhere to be. But he knows that the thirst is quenchable because he has seen the thing that quenches it. And so there comes a point in practice when we get to see the water in the well, and that serves as inspiration. Sure, you can still remember what it was like sitting in a cell facing life in prison when you wanted to die. That still inspires one to practice, but one can also remember what's on the other end of the spectrum. So yes, we can look back, but we can also look forward because we can recall what it was like to taste that sort of freedom, to taste that sort of joy that isn't dependent upon anything in the world. So I think I'm going to close with that. If there's any, I attend a lot of recovery meetings, and so when we do like speaker meetings, we often are asked to select a subject for conversation. So if I was going to give a prompt, it would be something along the lines of, where does your sense of urgency come from? Is it the suffering? Is it the joy? Is it both? And thanks for letting me talk to you tonight.